Behind the barbed wire of concentration camps, a new presence emerges, women in uniform, armed and unflinching. They were the female guards of the Reich, trained to enforce terror with whips, dogs, and rifles. Barely out of girlhood, they obeyed orders with chilling precision. For prisoners, survival meant enduring their cruelty. The Reich's legacy raises a haunting question: how did ordinary women become agents of atrocity? Welcome to the journals of history, as we reveal their terrifying story. In the pastoral countryside of Rechen, Lower Saxony, beneath the grey skies of October 1923, a child was born who would become one of history's most reviled figures. Irma Ida Ilse Grese entered a world already trembling with the aftershocks of Germany's devastating defeat in the Great War, where economic despair and political upheaval would shape an entire generation's relationship with cruelty and power. Her father, Alfred Grese, was a stern agricultural labourer whose hardened hands bore witness to a lifetime of toil in the unforgiving soil. By 1937, as the Nazi Party's poisonous ideology swept through German villages like a plague, Alfred embraced the movement with the fervour of a man seeking redemption for his nation's humiliation. "The party offers us a future," he would declare to neighbours, his weathered face reflecting the desperate hope that had seized millions of Germans during those tumultuous years. Berta Grese, Irma's mother, existed in the shadow of her husband's increasingly rigid authoritarianism, her voice growing quieter as the household filled with the rhetoric of racial superiority and nationalist fervour. The Grese household became a microcosm of Nazi indoctrination, where traditional parental discipline merged seamlessly with ideological brutality. Young Irma absorbed these lessons with disturbing enthusiasm, her blonde hair and blue eyes marking her as the embodiment of Aryan perfection that Nazi propaganda so fervently promoted. By her 15th year, she had joined the League of German Girls, where she learned to march in formation, to salute the Führer with unwavering devotion, and to view certain human beings as fundamentally inferior. She was always different from her siblings, recalled neighbour Heinrich Müller during post-war interrogations. There was a coldness in her eyes, even as a child. This emotional detachment, nurtured in an environment of ideological hatred, would prove to be the foundation upon which unimaginable horrors would later be built. The trajectory of Irma Grese's life shifted dramatically in the spring of 1940, when economic necessity drove her to seek employment beyond the confines of rural agricultural life. At 17, she found work in a dairy factory in nearby Hohenlichen, where the monotonous rhythm of industrial labour failed to satisfy her growing appetite for power and control. The factory supervisor, Otto Beckmann, would later testify that Grese possessed an unusual intensity when discussing the Reich's enemies, particularly the Jews. It was during this period that recruitment officers for the expanding concentration camp system began actively seeking young German women to serve as guards. The SS Helferinnenkorps, established to address the severe shortage of male personnel being deployed to the Eastern Front, offered young women like Grese an opportunity to serve the Reich while escaping the limitations of traditional female roles in Nazi society. In March 1943, at the age of 19, Irma Grese reported for duty at Ravensbrück concentration camp, the Reich's primary facility for female prisoners. The camp's Oberaufseherin Johanna Langefeld, a veteran administrator of the Nazi camp system, recognized in the young woman from Lower Saxony a particular aptitude for the dehumanizing work that would be required. She adapts quickly to camp discipline, Langefeld noted in her personnel records, shows promise for advancement. The transformation from village girl to instrument of systematic terror occurred with chilling rapidity. Within weeks of her arrival, Grese had mastered the complex hierarchy of camp brutality, learning to distinguish between the various categories of prisoners and to calibrate her violence accordingly. Jewish women, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses and Roma faced different degrees of systematic persecution, and Grese proved adept at navigating these distinctions with cold efficiency. In October 1943, Grese's superiors transferred her to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the full machinery of the Holocaust operated with industrial precision. Here, amid the smoke of the crematoria and the endless streams of cattle cars arriving from across Nazi-occupied Europe, she would earn her notorious reputation as one of the most feared figures in the camp system. SS Oberaufseherin Maria Mandl, who supervised female guards at Auschwitz, quickly identified Grese as exceptionally valuable personnel. Within months, she had been promoted to Oberaufseherin herself, wielding authority over thousands of female prisoners in the women's section of the vast complex. At 20 years old, she commanded a domain of unimaginable suffering with the detached efficiency of a seasoned administrator of death. Survivor testimony from the post-war trials provides harrowing insight into Greece's daily operations. Helena Kopper, a Polish political prisoner who served as a capo under Greece's supervision, testified that she would select at least 30 women each day for the gas chambers. The selection process became a ritualized expression of absolute power, with Grese moving through the barracks with her leather whip and German shepherd, arbitrarily determining who would live and who would die. When Irma Grese walked through the camp, recalled survivor Gisela Perl, a Hungarian Jewish physician who witnessed countless atrocities, even hardened criminals would tremble. Dr. Perl's testimony, delivered at the Belsen trial in 1945, painted a portrait of systematic sadism that defied comprehension. Greece would force prisoners to perform exhausting exercises in freezing weather, would set her dog upon those who showed signs of weakness, and would personally administer beatings that frequently resulted in death. The scope of her authority expanded throughout 1944 as the pace of extermination accelerated with the arrival of Hungarian Jews during the final phase of the Holocaust. Grese oversaw not only the daily selections for the gas chambers, but also supervised the complex logistics of processing new arrivals, stripping them of their possessions, their dignity, and ultimately their lives. As Soviet forces advanced toward Auschwitz in early 1945, the SS began evacuating personnel and destroying evidence of their crimes. In January, Grese received orders to transfer to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northwestern Germany, where she would spend the final months of the war presiding over some of the most horrific conditions in the entire Nazi camp system. Bergen-Belsen, originally established as a prisoner of war camp, had devolved into a hellscape of disease, starvation, and death as evacuees from camps in the east overwhelmed its facilities. When Allied forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945, they discovered approximately 60,000 prisoners in various stages of starvation and disease, with tens of thousands of unburied corpses scattered throughout the grounds. British Army Captain Derek Sington, among the first Allied officers to enter Belsen, described the scene in his official report. The dead lay everywhere, in the huts, in the compounds, along the roads. Many were so emaciated that they appeared more like skeletons than human beings. In this environment of absolute degradation, Grese continued to exercise her authority with characteristic ruthlessness. Survivor Renée Salt, a Polish Jewish woman who endured the final months at Belsen, testified that Grese continued to beat and terrorize prisoners even as British tanks approached the camp gates. This testimony, delivered during the war crimes trial, illustrated the complete moral bankruptcy that characterized Grese's worldview, her inability to recognize the humanity of those under her control even as her own world collapsed around her. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen brought the first comprehensive exposure of Nazi atrocities to the wider world as British and American journalists documented the unimaginable conditions for international audiences. Among the SS personnel captured at the camp, Irma Grese immediately stood out to Allied investigators, both for her youth and for the consistent testimony of survivors who identified her as one of the most brutal perpetrators. The Belsen trial began on September 17, 1945, in the German town of Lüneburg, with British military courts seeking to establish legal accountability for the atrocities committed at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Prosecutor Colonel T.M. Backhouse opened the proceedings by addressing the court. These defendants stand accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity that represent a fundamental assault on civilization itself. During the trial, witness after witness testified to Grese's systematic cruelty. Dr. Ada Bimko, a Polish Jewish physician who had been imprisoned at both Auschwitz and Belsen, provided devastating testimony. Irma Grese selected my friends for the gas chambers with the casualness of someone choosing fruit at a market. The accumulation of such testimonies painted an undeniable picture of deliberate participation in genocide. Grese herself proved to be an unrepentant defendant, showing no remorse for her actions and maintaining her belief in Nazi ideology even as the evidence of the Holocaust was presented in excruciating detail. Her defense attorney, Major Cranfield, struggled to present any meaningful mitigation, ultimately arguing lamely that she had been following orders and was too young to understand the full implications of her actions. On November 17, 1945, the court delivered its verdict. Grese, along with Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann, was sentenced to death by hanging. The Manchester Guardian reported that when the verdict was announced, Grese showed no emotion, maintaining the same cold demeanor that characterized her throughout the trial. The execution took place at Hammond Prison on December 13, 1945, with British executioner Albert Pierrepoint carrying out the sentence. At 22 years old, Irma Grese became the youngest Nazi war criminal to be executed in the aftermath of World War II, her death marking the end of a life that had become synonymous with the systematic dehumanization that defined the Nazi era. In the pastoral tranquility of Fürstgen, a small agricultural village in Brandenburg, Prussia, the spring of 1920 brought forth another child into a world still recovering from the devastation of the Great War. Dorothea Theodora Binz entered life during a period when German society struggled to reconstitute itself after military defeat, economic collapse, and the profound psychological trauma of lost empire and shattered national identity. Her father, Wilhelm Binz, worked the family's modest farm with the methodical persistence that characterized rural German life during the interwar period. The Binz household reflected the values of discipline, order, and unquestioning respect for authority that would prove to be fertile ground for Nazi ideology when it arrived in their remote corner of Brandenburg. Her mother, Bertha, managed domestic affairs with the same systematic approach that governed all aspects of rural German existence during this era of economic uncertainty. Young Dorothea's childhood unfolded against a backdrop of increasing political radicalization as the Nazi Party extended its influence into the most remote corners of German society. The party's message of national renewal, racial superiority, and the promise of restored greatness resonated powerfully in rural communities that felt abandoned by the urban-centered politics of the Weimar Republic. Local Nazi Party records, preserved in post-war archives, document the systematic infiltration of institutions throughout Brandenburg during the early 1930s. The village school, where Dorothea received her elementary education, became an early site of Nazi indoctrination, with teachers required to integrate racial theory and nationalist ideology into their curriculum. Her school records, reviewed during post-war investigations, show a student of average academic ability but exceptional conformity to the new ideological requirements. She was always eager to please authority figures, recalled her teacher Herr Schmidt during Allied interrogations in 1946. She would volunteer to lead the class in singing Nazi songs and seemed to derive satisfaction from reporting classmates who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for party activities. This early pattern of seeking approval through zealous compliance with official ideology would prove to be a defining characteristic throughout her subsequent career. As Germany mobilized for war in the late 1930s, the expansion of the concentration camp system created unprecedented opportunities for young Germans to serve the Reich in capacities previously unimaginable. The SS Helferinnenkorps, established to address critical personnel shortages as German men were deployed to military service, actively recruited young women from rural areas who were deemed ideologically reliable and physically capable of the demanding work required in the camps. Dorothea Binz, then 19 years old and working as a shopkeeper's assistant in the nearby town of Grefenhainichen, responded to recruitment advertisements that portrayed concentration camp service as essential war work combining patriotic duty with professional advancement. The recruitment materials, crafted by SS propaganda specialists, emphasized the camp's role in protecting the German people from dangerous elements, while offering young women the opportunity to serve the fatherland in its hour of greatest need. Her application for camp service, preserved in SS personnel files captured after the war, reveals a young woman eager to demonstrate her ideological commitment and personal suitability for the work. Under the section requesting explanation of her motivations for applying, she wrote, "I wish to serve the Reich by helping to guard its enemies and protect the German people from those who would harm them." This language, reflecting the standard Nazi characterization of concentration camp prisoners as dangerous criminals rather than innocent victims, indicates the success of ideological conditioning even before her formal training began. In February 1939, Binz reported to Ravensbrück concentration camp for training as an Aufseherin, female guard. Ravensbrück, established the previous year as the Reich's primary concentration camp for women, served as both a site of imprisonment and a training ground for female SS personnel who would later be deployed throughout the expanding camp system. The training program at Ravensbrück was designed by SS Oberführer Max Kögel and his staff to transform ordinary German women into effective instruments of the Nazi regime's racial policies. The curriculum combined ideological indoctrination with practical instruction in camp administration, prisoner management, and the implementation of punishment protocols designed to break the will of those deemed enemies of the Reich. Oberaufseherin Johanna Langefeld, who supervised the training of female guards, maintained detailed records of each recruit's progress through the program. Her evaluation of Binz, dated March 15, 1939, noted, "Shows excellent aptitude for camp discipline, demonstrates proper understanding of the racial political foundations of our work, recommended for advancement." This assessment reflected not merely Binz's ability to learn camp procedures, but her enthusiasm for the ideological framework that justified the systematic dehumanization of prisoners. The training regimen included extensive instruction in Nazi racial theory, designed to provide intellectual justification for treating certain categories of human beings as fundamentally inferior and deserving of harsh treatment. Binz's training records include examination results showing perfect scores on tests covering racial classification systems, the identification of degenerate characteristics, and the proper implementation of policies designed to maintain racial purity within the German population. Perhaps most significantly, the training program included desensitization exercises designed to overcome normal human empathy and moral inhibitions against violence. New guards were gradually exposed to increasing levels of brutality, beginning with witnessing punishments and progressing to active participation in beatings, selections, and other forms of systematic cruelty. SS training documents, captured by Allied forces and preserved in the National Archives, reveal the sophisticated psychological techniques employed to normalize participation in atrocities. The guard must learn to see prisoners not as individuals with human feelings, explained one training manual, but as representatives of dangerous ideologies and racial contamination that threaten the German people. This dehumanization process proved essential to enabling ordinary individuals like Binz to participate in genocide without experiencing debilitating psychological distress. By the spring of 1940, Dorothea Binz had completed her training and assumed regular duties as an Aufseherin at Ravensbrück. Her early assignments included supervision of prisoner work details, conducting roll calls, and maintaining discipline within the barracks housing political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other categories of women deemed dangerous to the Nazi state. Camp administrative records document her rapid advancement through the guard hierarchy as supervisors recognized her exceptional effectiveness in implementing camp policies. Within 18 months of her arrival, she had been promoted to the rank of Oberaufseherin, with authority over entire sections of the camp and responsibility for training newly arrived guards in the techniques she had mastered. Survivor testimony from post-war trials provides harrowing insight into Binz's methods of maintaining control over the thousands of women imprisoned at Ravensbrück. Violette Lecoq, a French resistance fighter who survived 3 years of imprisonment, testified that when Binz appeared at morning roll call, absolute silence would fall over the entire Appellplatz. This atmosphere of terror reflected the systematic use of unpredictable violence to maintain psychological control over the prisoner population. The selection of victims for punishment became a carefully orchestrated ritual designed to maximize the psychological impact on the broader prisoner community. Maria Wiedmeyer, an Austrian political prisoner who witnessed countless atrocities, described Binz's technique. She would walk slowly through the ranks during roll call, occasionally stopping to stare at a particular woman. The tension was unbearable because we knew she was deciding who would be beaten, who would be sent to the punishment block, who might be selected for transport to the gas chambers. Binz's reputation for cruelty extended beyond the standard brutalities that characterized all Nazi concentration camps. Survivors consistently testified to her innovation in developing new forms of psychological torture, her evident pleasure in causing suffering, and her ability to identify and exploit the particular vulnerabilities of individual prisoners. As World War II progressed and the Nazi regime's policies became increasingly radical, Ravensbrück evolved from a site of imprisonment and forced labor into an active center of extermination. The construction of gas chambers and crematorium facilities in 1944 marked a new phase in the camp's operation, with Binz playing a crucial role in implementing the accelerated murder program. Her responsibilities expanded to include participation in the selection process that determined which prisoners would be murdered immediately and which would be preserved temporarily for slave labor. This process, conducted with the systematic efficiency that characterized all aspects of Nazi administration, required guards like Binz to make rapid life and death decisions based on racial ideology and economic calculation. Dr. Gerhard Schiedlowski, the camp's chief medical officer, worked closely with Binz in implementing the selection protocols. His post-war testimony, given under Allied interrogation, described her as exceptionally reliable in identifying prisoners suitable for special treatment, using the Nazi euphemism for murder. This bureaucratic language masked the reality of systematic genocide while enabling participants to maintain psychological distance from their actions. The gas chamber operations at Ravensbrück required extensive coordination between various camp departments, with Binz serving as a crucial link between the administrative apparatus and the actual implementation of mass murder. Her role included managing the logistics of moving selected prisoners to the killing facility, maintaining the deception that they were being transferred for medical treatment, and ensuring that the process proceeded with the efficiency demanded by Berlin headquarters. As Allied forces advanced toward Germany in early 1945, conditions at Ravensbrück deteriorated catastrophically. The camp, designed to hold approximately 6,000 prisoners, contained nearly 45,000 women by the beginning of the year. Overcrowding, disease, and the systematic murder of prisoners deemed no longer useful created conditions that challenged even the SS's capacity for organized brutality. In this environment of accelerating chaos, Binz maintained her authority through increasingly extreme measures. British intelligence reports, based on survivor testimonies collected immediately after liberation, describe her continuing to conduct selections and executions even as Allied artillery could be heard approaching the camp. This adherence to Nazi procedures in the face of obvious defeat reflected the complete ideological transformation that her training and service had achieved. The arrival of Swedish Red Cross officials in April 1945, negotiating for the release of Scandinavian prisoners, provided crucial documentation of conditions during the camp's final weeks. Count Volker Bernadotte, who led these negotiations, recorded in his official report, The female guards, led by a woman named Binz, continued to terrorize prisoners until the very moment of our arrival, showing no recognition that their regime was collapsing around them. Soviet forces liberated Ravensbrück on April 30th, 1945, discovering scenes that challenged the capacity of even battle-hardened soldiers to comprehend. The camp contained thousands of unburied corpses, survivors in advanced stages of starvation and disease, and extensive evidence of systematic murder that would later be presented at war crimes trials. Binz was among the SS personnel captured during the liberation, though she initially attempted to escape by discarding her uniform and claiming to be a civilian worker. Her identification by survivors, who recognized her despite her attempted disguise, led to her immediate arrest and transfer to Allied custody for investigation of war crimes. The Ravensbrück trial, which began in December 1946 before a British military court in Hamburg, represented one of the most comprehensive efforts to establish legal accountability for crimes committed at the women's concentration camp. Dorothea Binz stood among 16 defendants facing charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, accused of participating in the systematic murder and abuse of thousands of prisoners. The prosecution, led by Colonel J.M.T. Churchill, presented evidence documenting the systematic nature of the crimes committed at Ravensbrück and Binz's central role in their implementation. Witness after witness testified to her personal involvement in selections, beatings, and the general atmosphere of terror that characterized daily life in the camp. Dr. Gerda Quernheim, a German political prisoner who had served as a camp physician, provided devastating testimony. Binz selected prisoners for death with the efficiency of a clerk processing routine paperwork. The accumulation of such testimonies painted an undeniable picture of systematic participation in genocide that extended far beyond mere compliance with orders. Binz's defense attorney, Major Smallwood, struggled to present meaningful mitigation, ultimately arguing that she had been corrupted by a system beyond her control. However, survivor testimony consistently contradicted this portrayal, revealing instead an individual who had embraced her role with evident enthusiasm and had frequently exceeded the minimum requirements of her duties in pursuing cruelty. On February 3, 1947, the military tribunal delivered its verdict. Dorothea Binz was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. The court's judgment explicitly noted that the defendant showed no mercy to those under her power and deserves none from this court. British executioner Albert Pierrepoint carried out the sentence on May 2, 1947, at Hameln Prison. At 27 years old, Dorothea Binz died for crimes that had transformed her from a provincial shopkeeper into an essential instrument of systematic genocide. Born into the industrial landscape of Schönau, Silesia in September 1919, Elisabeth Becker entered a world where compliance and conformity would shape her destiny in ways neither she nor her family could have anticipated. Her father, Johann Becker, worked in the local textile mills that defined the economic life of their small community, while her mother, Anna, managed a household that reflected the modest aspirations of Germany's working class during the tumultuous interwar period. The Becker family's life unfolded against the backdrop of Germany's economic collapse and subsequent political transformation. As young Elisabeth grew through her formative years, the rise of the Nazi Party brought both promises of renewed prosperity and the systematic erosion of moral boundaries that had once defined civilized behavior. Unlike some of her contemporaries who embraced Nazi ideology with zealous enthusiasm, Elisabeth's path toward complicity followed a more subtle trajectory of gradual accommodation to increasingly extreme demands. Her childhood neighbors would later describe her as unremarkable and obedient, qualities that in another era might have led to a life of quiet domesticity. However, these same characteristics, the willingness to follow authority without question, the absence of strong moral convictions that might resist ideological pressure, would prove to be precisely the attributes the Nazi regime sought in its functionaries. She never caused trouble, recalled her elementary school teacher Margaret Hoffman during post-war investigations. She did what she was told, when she was told to do it. This pattern of unquestioning compliance, instilled from an early age, would later manifest in her participation in the systematic extermination of human beings with the same mechanical obedience that characterized her approach to schoolwork. As Germany mobilized for total war in 1941, the expanding concentration camp system faced critical personnel shortages. The deployment of millions of German men to military service created opportunities for women to enter roles previously considered beyond the scope of traditional gender roles. For young women like Elisabeth, now 22 and working as a hairdresser in Breslau, the recruitment announcements for concentration camp guard positions offered economic stability and the promise of serving the fatherland during its hour of greatest need. The recruitment process itself was carefully designed to normalize the extraordinary nature of the work involved. SS Oberführer Richard Glucks, who oversaw the concentration camp system from his headquarters in Berlin, had developed sophisticated protocols for identifying and training female guards who could be relied upon to implement the Reich's racial policies without hesitation or moral qualm. Elisabeth Becker reported to Ravensbrück concentration camp in October 1941, where she would undergo 6 weeks of intensive training under the supervision of Oberaufseherin Johanna Langefeld. The training regimen was designed not merely to teach practical skills, but to systematically break down normal human empathy and replace it with bureaucratic efficiency in the service of mass murder. "The prisoners are enemies of the Reich," Langefeld explained to new recruits during orientation sessions, as recorded in SS training documents preserved in post-war archives. "They have forfeited their rights through their actions against the German people." This ideological framework provided the intellectual foundation for treating human beings as mere administrative problems to be solved through violence and ultimately elimination. The transformation of Elisabeth Becker into Elisabeth Volkenrath, following her marriage to SS Rottenführer Heinz Volkenrath in March 1942, occurred simultaneously with her evolution from civilian hairdresser to professional administrator of suffering. Her personnel files, maintained with characteristic German thoroughness, document her rapid advancement through the camp hierarchy, as supervisors noted her reliability and attention to detail in carrying out increasingly brutal assignments. In March 1942, newly married Elisabeth Volkenrath received transfer orders to Auschwitz concentration camp, where she would spend the next 3 years at the epicenter of the Nazi genocide. The Auschwitz complex, with its infamous slogan, "Arbeit macht frei," work makes free, ironically welded above the main gate, had evolved by this time into the most efficient killing facility in human history. At Auschwitz, Volkenrath worked directly under the supervision of SS Oberaufseherin Maria Mandl, a woman whose organizational skills had made her indispensable to the smooth operation of the camp's extermination facilities. Under Mandl's tutelage, Volkenrath learned to manage the complex logistics of processing new arrivals, conducting selections for immediate murder or temporary slave labor, and maintaining discipline among the thousands of women prisoners under her authority. The daily routine of mass murder at Auschwitz-Birkenau required a vast network of collaborators, each playing a specific role in the machinery of death. Volkenrath's position as a senior female guard placed her at crucial junctures in this process, supervising the arrival of deportation trains, conducting selections for the gas chambers, and overseeing the complex of women's barracks where temporary survivors endured conditions designed to destroy their humanity before ultimately claiming their lives. Survivor Primo Levi, though imprisoned in the men's section of Auschwitz, captured the systematic nature of this dehumanization in his post-war writings. The camps were not merely centers of elimination, but laboratories for the destruction of human dignity. Women guards like Volkenrath served as essential instruments in this laboratory, implementing policies designed to strip prisoners of their identity, their connections to one another, and ultimately, their will to live. Testimony from the Belsen trial provides chilling insight into Volkenrath's daily activities during her Auschwitz years. Dr. Gisela Perl, the Hungarian Jewish physician who survived both camps, testified that Volkenrath conducted selections with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat processing paperwork. This administrative approach to mass murder, treating genocide as merely another organizational challenge to be solved through proper procedures, exemplified the banality of evil that characterized much of the Holocaust. The selection process at Auschwitz represented the ultimate expression of Nazi racial ideology translated into bureaucratic practice. As newly arrived deportation trains pulled up to the ramp at Birkenau, SS physicians and senior guards like Volkenrath would sort the arrivals into two categories: those deemed temporarily useful for slave labor, and those to be murdered immediately in the gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. Volkenrath's role in these selections was documented through multiple survivor testimonies during the post-war trials. Helena Kopper, a Polish political prisoner who served as a capo in the women's section, testified that Volkenrath would walk among new arrivals with clipboard in hand, making notations that determined who would live through the night. This bureaucratization of murder, reducing human lives to administrative decisions documented on official forms, represented a crucial element in the Nazi system's ability to implement genocide on an industrial scale. The psychological mechanisms that enabled ordinary individuals like Volkenrath to participate in mass murder have been the subject of extensive post-war analysis. SS training protocols, preserved in captured German archives, reveal sophisticated techniques for normalizing participation in atrocities through incremental involvement, ideological conditioning, and the diffusion of individual responsibility within hierarchical structures. Each guard was responsible only for following specific orders, explained SS Oberführer Richard Glucks in captured training documents. The larger policy decisions were made at higher levels. This compartmentalization of responsibility allowed individuals like Volkenrath to participate in genocide while maintaining psychological distance from the full scope of their actions. Yet survivor testimony consistently contradicts this portrayal of passive compliance, revealing instead active participation in cruelty that extended far beyond the minimum requirements of official duties. Dr. Ada Bimco, testifying at the Belsen trial, stated that Volkenrath took visible pleasure in the power to determine life and death, describing instances where the guard would deliberately separate mothers from children during selections, savoring the anguish this caused. As Soviet forces approached Auschwitz in January 1945, the SS began implementing plans for the systematic destruction of evidence and the evacuation of personnel. Elisabeth Volkenrath was among the guards transferred to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where she would spend the final months of the war presiding over some of the most horrific conditions in the entire Nazi camp system. Bergen-Belsen during this period had devolved into what British liberating forces would describe as hell on earth. The camp, originally designed to house 10,000 prisoners, contained nearly 60,000 individuals in various stages of starvation and disease. When Allied forces arrived in April 1945, thousands of unburied corpses littered the grounds, victims of typhus, tuberculosis, starvation, and systematic murder. In this environment of absolute degradation, Volkenrath continued to implement Nazi policies with mechanical precision. Survivor testimony from the liberation period describes her maintaining the pretense of administrative order even as the camp descended into apocalyptic chaos. British military personnel who processed camp survivors noted that Volkenrath's barracks were identified by multiple witnesses as locations where beatings and murders continued until the very day of liberation. Captain Derek Sington, among the first British officers to enter Belsen, recorded in his official report that the female guards maintained their authority through terror even as their world collapsed around them. This observation captured the essential character of functionaries like Volkenrath, whose identity had become so completely fused with the Nazi system that they could not conceive of existence outside its structure of organized brutality. The Bergen-Belsen trial, which began in September 1945, represented one of the first comprehensive attempts by the international community to establish legal accountability for the crimes of the Holocaust. Elisabeth Volkenrath found herself among 45 defendants facing charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, accused of participating in the systematic murder of thousands of prisoners at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Prosecutor Colonel T.M. Backhaus, in his opening statement, characterized the defendants as representing a system of organized inhumanity that challenges the fundamental assumptions of civilized society. The prosecution's case against Volkenrath rested not on allegations of extraordinary sadism, but rather on documented evidence of her systematic participation in the bureaucratic machinery of genocide. The prosecution presented testimony from dozens of survivors, each providing specific instances of Volkenrath's involvement in selections, beatings, and the general maintenance of camp discipline through terror. Dr. Gisela Pearl, whose medical training had made her an acute observer of camp conditions, testified that Volkenrath's efficiency in processing deportees for extermination exceeded even that of her more notorious colleagues. Volkenrath's defense, presented by Captain Monroe, attempted to portray her as a minor functionary who had simply followed orders within a system beyond her control. "My client was a young woman thrust into circumstances she neither sought nor understood," Monroe argued in his closing statement. "She followed orders as any soldier must, without knowledge of their larger implications." However, this defense crumbled under the weight of survivor testimony that documented Volkenrath's active participation in atrocities that went far beyond mere compliance with orders. Witnesses described instances where she had volunteered for selection duties, had personally beaten prisoners to death, and had shown evident satisfaction in exercising the power of life and death over those under her control. On November 17, 1945, the military tribunal delivered its verdict. Elisabeth Volkenrath was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. The court's decision reflected not only her individual culpability, but also served as a broader condemnation of the system of complicity that had made the Holocaust possible. At 26 years old, Elisabeth Volkenrath died for crimes that had transformed her from an unremarkable hairdresser into an essential component of history's most systematic genocide. The lives and fates of Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Dorothea Binz reveal how willing individuals can become active participants in history's most systematic persecution. These women were not helpless cogs trapped by forces beyond their control. They made choices, they embraced Nazi ideology, and they spread fear among the powerless. Their conduct at the camps was not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate exercise of cruelty and domination. Their trials and sentences in 1945 and 1947 were not tragedies, but a measure of justice for lives spent furthering a system of destruction. They stand as reminders not of ordinary weakness, but of the alarming depths to which ordinary people can descend when they surrender conscience to hate.